Vanessa Marquardt was born on June 17, 1989 in the small town of Leominster, Massachusetts. Her parents divorced soon after her birth, but Vanessa's father remained very involved in her life. He stayed in the same town and tried to spend as much time as possible with his daughter. From a young age, Vanessa developed a strong love for nature and sports, thanks to her father. They often went hiking, skied in the nearby mountains, and visited the ocean to enjoy beach. Later on, Vanessa became passionate about yoga and jogging, even taking part in 2 major charity marathons. Vanessa was also dedicated to her education and aimed to build a successful career. After high school, she went to Boston University and earned a degree in communications. She worked at several local companies before landing her dream job at Google, which led her to move to New York City. Vanessa was excited about her new job and worked hard to move up in her career. Even with her busy schedule, she made time for charity, trying to help others. Vanessa also tried to visit her family as often as possible. They lived in a small town called Princeton, not far from her hometown, which was about 180 miles from New York. In early August 2016, when Vanessa was 27, she visited her family for the weekend and stayed at her mom's house. She spent time with relatives, caught up with friends, and planned to head back to New York on Sunday, August 7th. That morning, Vanessa spent some time at home with her mom, and in the afternoon, she decided to go for a jog. With a few hours left until her bus, she had plenty of time to enjoy her run. She decided to run along the road near her mother's house. Although there were a few other houses along the way, they were mostly hidden by dense trees. Vanessa was supposed to be back in about half an hour, but she never returned. Her mom started to worry, knowing Vanessa still had to pack and catch her bus. She tried calling her, but Vanessa didn't pick up. About an hour after she left the house, Vanessa's phone started going straight to voicemail, making her mom even more anxious. She kept trying to reach her daughter, but there was no response. Her last hope was that Vanessa might have decided to meet some friends or visit other family members before heading back to New York. Her mom contacted all their relatives, but none of them had seen Vanessa. Fearing something bad had happened to her daughter, she decided to call the police. Officers spoke with her mom and began searching along the route Vanessa was supposed to jog. Her relatives and friends quickly joined the search, hoping to find her safe and well. Vanessa's bus to New York was scheduled to leave at 5:30 p.m., and everyone hoped she would show up by then. But when the bus left without her, it became clear that something serious had happened. Vanessa was very responsible about her work and would never miss the last bus. The search went on for several hours. The local police department requested assistance from the state police, who sent several officers with search dogs. Vanessa's father actively participated in the search and was extremely distressed. At one point, the police even had to ask him to go home because his anxiety was disrupting the process. Around 8:20 p.m., one of the search teams headed deeper into the woods, less than a mile from Vanessa's mother's house. The dogs led the officers in a specific direction, and soon they discovered a human body on the ground. Despite numerous bruises, the police immediately realized it was Vanessa Marquardt. Her clothes were missing except for one sneaker lying near the crime scene. In addition to the bruises, there were clear signs of burns on her body, and the sneaker was also partially burned. The police thought that the perpetrator might have attempted to dispose of the body and evidence using fire, but failed. They also suspected that Vanessa had been assaulted, which could have been the motive for the unknown killer. Detectives noted that along with the victim's clothes, her headphones and smartphone were also missing. Since these items were not found anywhere near the body, the perpetrator might have taken them. The body was handed over to medical examiners while the police began searching for suspects. Residents of Princeton, who quickly learned about what had happened, were shocked and scared. Their small town was considered very safe, and the last murder had occurred over 30 years ago. Now, with the news of Vanessa's murder and the horrific details, the town plunged into panic. People feared that the killer might be one of their own and worried that he could strike again. Medical examiners determined that the cause of death was strangulation. Vanessa had also sustained numerous injuries, some indicating that she had tried to fight off her attacker. Skin particles were found under her nails, and DNA analysis revealed that they belonged to an unknown man. Investigators immediately entered his DNA profile into the FBI database, but no matches were found. Despite this, the DNA profile became their only major piece of evidence. Now, the police could compare DNA samples from suspects with this profile. They also knew that the attacker likely had fresh scratches on his body, which could help identify him more quickly. Regarding the burns on Vanessa's body, experts found traces of an accelerant and determined it was gasoline. It seemed like the perpetrator had tried to use it to destroy evidence and the body right after the murder. The medical examiners couldn't conclusively determine if Vanessa had been sexually assaulted, but detectives continued to consider it a primary motive. They also didn't rule out the possibility that the attacker might have known the victim and had personal motives. Detectives put all their efforts into finding the perpetrator and turned to the local community for help. With Princeton's population of just 3,000, many residents knew each other, so the police hoped someone might have crucial information. They also asked people to be on the lookout for a man with fresh scratches, and soon their efforts paid off. A witness came forward, saying he had been driving along the road on the day of the murder around 12:45 p.m. He saw a dark SUV with the hood up on the roadside and a Latino man standing next to it. The man was of medium height and solid build, appearing to be between 20 and 30 years old. The witness didn't recall any other details since he had driven by at high speed. The only detail he could provide was that the man had short hair or a completely shaved head. An hour and a half later, the witness drove back along the same road and noticed the SUV was still there. This time, the hood was down, all the windows were closed, and the man was nowhere to be seen. The witness added that he hadn't thought much of it at the time, but after hearing about Vanessa's murder, he realized he might have seen the perpetrator. Another witness reported seeing Vanessa that day as she headed toward the road. According to him, a car was following her. The driver first passed by, then turned around and started following her again. Unfortunately, the witness couldn't see the license plate or remember any other details about the car. Soon, detectives received another lead. A witness working at a ski resort 10 minutes drive from Princeton noticed a suspicious man with a scratched face. This man was caught on surveillance camera and the witness provided the footage to the police. Thanks to the footage, they quickly identified the man and began investigating his possible involvement, but soon concluded that he was likely not the killer. A DNA analysis later confirmed this, and the man was cleared of suspicion. Over the next few weeks, police received more than 1,000 tips, some of which seemed very promising. They diligently checked each one, but repeatedly hit dead ends, failing to get any closer to catching the culprit. Detectives investigated local residents as well as people from other towns. They also looked into owners of dark SUVs, but none of these efforts yielded results. Vanessa's family couldn't sit still and wanted to contribute to the investigation. They put up flyers with information about the case in nearby towns and launched a website with all the details about the case. Despite the large number of tips and the community's involvement, with each passing week, investigators grew more and more discouraged. They had checked hundreds of men in the area and looked into Vanessa's acquaintances, but each lead ended up going nowhere. Several FBI profilers studied the case and concluded that the person who killed Vanessa most likely didn't know her and committed the crime spontaneously. They suggested that he might have driven by, seen Vanessa, and decided to assault her. They also noted that the perpetrator was likely living in Princeton or nearby towns or regularly visiting Princeton, possibly to see relatives or for work. Given the brutality of the attack, the profiler speculated that the killer might be a sociopath, making him harder to identify. Sociopaths not only lack guilt but are also skilled liars. The murderer could have acted completely normal after the crime, as if nothing had happened, and avoided drawing attention to himself. In the following months, the case made little progress, even though the local police department continued to work diligently on it. However, the more leads they followed, the less likely it seemed that they would be able to identify the perpetrator. But everything suddenly changed 9 months after the murder in a quite unexpected way. In April 2017, a state patrol officer was driving through the town of Worcester, about 18 miles from Princeton. At one point, he spotted a black SUV with a Latino man with short hair behind the wheel. Vanessa's case was well known among the police in the area, so the officer immediately recalled that the driver's appearance and vehicle matched witness descriptions. The patrol officer quickly grabbed a pen and wrote down the license plate number on his hand while the vehicle was still in view. Upon returning to the station, he checked the plate and found that the SUV was registered to a 31-year-old Angelo Ortiz, and he passed this information along to the detectives. Ortiz had no criminal record and had been living in Worcester with his girlfriend and 3 children for less than a year. Officers went to his house to request a DNA sample, but there was a problem. When Ortiz opened the door, they realized he barely spoke English. Fortunately, one of the officers knew Spanish, and Ortiz's girlfriend, who was also home, helped translate for him. During the conversation, Ortiz provided a DNA sample which was immediately sent to the lab. While waiting for the results, detectives decided to dig deeper into Ortiz's background. They discovered that he worked as a delivery driver, transporting packages from a warehouse to various post offices in the area. This indicated that he knew the area well and frequently visited nearby towns like Princeton. Detectives also requested GPS data from Ortiz's smartphone, and the results were quite intriguing. Although the carrier could only provide approximate data based on cell towers, it showed that Ortiz was in Princeton at the time of Vanessa's attack, specifically in the area where her body was found. Digging deeper, police learned that after the murder, Ortiz made a purchase at a gas station in a neighboring town, just a few miles away. He bought only $5 worth of gasoline, as shown by his bank records. He had filled a small gas can, and as we recall, traces of gasoline were found on the victim's body. All of this strongly suggested to the detectives that Ortiz was likely involved in the crime. Soon they received the lab results. His DNA matched the skin particles found under Vanessa's nails. With confirmation of his involvement, the police finally arrested Ortiz. He denied any involvement in the murder, so the case went to court. With the evidence they had, including DNA results and GPS data from the day of the murder, the prosecution was confident they could secure a conviction. However, an unexpected problem arose. When Ortiz hired lawyers, they claimed that the police had obtained his DNA sample illegally, meaning it should be excluded from the evidence. They argued that the language barrier prevented Ortiz from understanding what was happening and from giving consent to the DNA collection. Ortiz insisted that he had signed a document he didn't understand and only provided the DNA sample because his girlfriend told him to do so. This situation posed a major challenge for the prosecution. Even with the undeniable DNA match, the defense's request could have jeopardized the case and led to Ortiz being released. The matter was deliberated for quite some time, but ultimately, the judge decided to uphold the DNA test results. Despite this, Ortiz still refused to confess, and the preparations for the trial dragged on for several years. Throughout this period, Ortiz remained in jail, as he was unable to pay the $10 million bail. In total, the wait for the trial lasted over 6 years from the time of the murder, with multiple delays for various reasons. For Vanessa's family, who had already suffered an immense loss, the waiting was extremely painful. During this time, investigators gathered more information that cast Ortiz in an unfavorable light. Though he had lived in the city for less than a year, Ortiz had earned a bad reputation. Several women in his neighborhood told police that they found Ortiz extremely unpleasant. He often made rude, intimate comments about them, and they were afraid to be near him. A former employee of the Princeton post office shared some interesting details. She frequently encountered Ortiz at work because he had been delivering packages. Almost every day, he made inappropriate comments in Spanish about her and another employee, seemingly unaware that she understood the language. She felt very uncomfortable every time he came by and was genuinely afraid of him. Moreover, this woman often walked to work along the same road where Vanessa had jogged. After hearing about Vanessa's death, she could no longer bear to live in the town and moved out. Eventually, the prosecution decided to offer Ortiz a deal, giving him a chance to be released at least in old age. Without the deal, he would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. So after some consideration, Ortiz agreed, and in October 2022, he pled guilty before the judge. As is often the case, the terms of the deal did not require Ortiz to provide any details of his crime. He only needed to admit his guilt, which he did. While the deal might seem unfair, the prosecution secured pretty strict terms. Ortiz was sentenced to 20 years for robbery as he had taken Vanessa's phone and headphones and received a sentence of 25 years to life with the possibility of parole only after 45 years. This means Ortiz can seek release only after he turns 81. Tragically, Vanessa's father, who had been awaiting justice for his daughter's murder, passed away just 10 days before the sentencing due to health problems. At the trial, his ex-wife stated that he died of a broken heart and unbearable grief caused by the murderer. Ortiz himself showed no signs of remorse or regret during his sentencing. Instead, he asked his lawyer to read a statement on his behalf. The lawyer stated that Ortiz understood why Vanessa's family saw him as a monster. However, he asked them to remember that he is also a person with a family that had supported him throughout the ordeal. He apologized to his own family for the pain he had caused them, but did not apologize to Vanessa's relatives. Ortiz was then sent back to prison, where he remains to this day. After Vanessa's death, her family and friends founded an organization named in her honor. Initially, they focused on offering self-defense courses for women, but over the years, their goals have expanded significantly. And now they work on a wide range of issues related to women's safety and the prevention of violence in all its forms. Michelle Bright was born on June 2, 1981, in a small Australian town called Goolgong. With a population of around 2,500 people, this quiet, close-knit community was far removed from big cities. Everyone knew each other, and because of its remote location, outsiders rarely passed through. Michelle lived there with her parents and 2 older brothers. She attended the local school where she had many friends, played basketball, and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Her love for animals was so strong that she even had her own horse. On top of that, Michelle wanted to have a big family of her own one day with 6 kids. By 1999, when she was 17, Michelle was focused on her studies. She aimed for top grades, hoping that it would make it easier for her to get into vet school. On February 26th, Michelle was planning to attend her friend's birthday party. The plan was to gather at her friend's house, and afterwards, Michelle intended to spend the night at another friend's place since her home was quite a distance away. That evening, Michelle's mom drove her to the party because Michelle didn't have a car of her own. Before getting out of the car, Michelle said she'd see her mom the next morning, and they said their goodbyes. The next day, when Michelle's mom woke up, she noticed that her daughter still wasn't home. At first, she assumed Michelle was sleeping in late at her friend's place, but as the hours passed, her worry began to grow. Michelle didn't have a cell phone, so around noon, her mom started calling her friends to check on her. Eventually, she learned that Michelle had left the party around 12:30 a.m., with a couple who offered to drop her off in the town center. From there, Michelle only had a short walk to her other friend's house. But to her mom's surprise, she found out that Michelle never made it there. The realization deepened her concern. Hoping that maybe Michelle had decided to stay with someone else, she continued calling her friends, but all of them said they hadn't seen Michelle that night. By the time Michelle's mom had contacted all of her daughter's friends, several hours had passed and she still hadn't found any trace of her. With no other options left, she decided to go to the police, but she quickly ran into a problem. The local officers assumed Michelle was either out with friends or had run away from home, so they refused to start a search. Despite her best efforts to convince them that Michelle would never just run away from home like that, the officers wouldn't budge. Left with no choice, Michelle's mom, along with other family members, started searching on their own. They spoke with townspeople and walked the streets, but there were no signs of Michelle anywhere. This went on for several days until March 2nd. That evening, a man was out walking his dog along a road leading out of town. As he passed by an old railway near a field, something odd caught his eye in the tall grass. When he got closer, he realized it was a human body and called the police. The officers immediately recognized the victim as Michelle Bright. Her clothing was partially missing and her bra had been torn off. Michelle's bag was found near her body, but there were no other clues at the scene. What stood out was how close the body was to Michelle's home, only about half a mile away. But because of the tall grass, it was nearly impossible to spot from a distance. The medical examiner found several bruises on Michelle's body and determined that she had been strangled. They also concluded that she had been assaulted, but no biological evidence from the attacker was discovered. In her hand, they found a few strands of hair, but unfortunately, they couldn't extract a DNA sample from them either. Now that the police were dealing with a murder, they finally began their investigation. Their first step was to interview everyone who had attended the party. According to experts, the time of death was likely the same night she disappeared, meaning someone at the party might have been involved or at least knew something. Everyone claimed that the party was peaceful and without any conflicts. No one saw Michelle arguing or fighting with anyone. She was in good spirits and left with a couple who had offered her a ride. The police spoke with this couple and they confirmed that they dropped Michelle off on the main street in town where she planned to walk to her friend's house. After that, they drove off and didn't see which direction she went. Her friend told investigators that Michelle never made it to her place that night. The investigators suspected that either she was attacked before she could reach her friend's house or for some reason, Michelle changed her mind and decided to head home instead. The investigators doubted that the victim could have been attacked in the middle of the street. They interviewed everyone who lived nearby, and no one heard any screams or unusual noises. Because of this, the police believe that Michelle might have known her attacker. It's possible he offered her a ride home and instead drove her to the location where her body would later be found. Michelle's family also insisted that she would never have gotten into a car with a stranger. Besides, their small town, outsiders were rare, so she would have recognized anyone local. Over the next few weeks, the police continued questioning various people, trying to find witnesses or any leads. They also started looking at potential suspects, asking for their DNA samples. Even though the experts couldn't obtain a DNA sample from the killer, this information wasn't made public. The investigators hoped that as DNA analysis technology advanced, they might be able to extract a genetic profile of the perpetrator from the victim's belongings or another evidence. One of the first suspects was Michelle's ex-boyfriend. The police found out that she had broken up with him shortly before her death, and according to their friends, he wasn't happy about it. But there was no evidence against him, and investigators couldn't determine whether he had the opportunity to be on the street where Michelle was walking the night she was killed. Another local resident raised suspicion, because he seemed overly distraught about Michelle's death, even though they barely knew each other. But like with her ex-boyfriend, there was no way to connect this man to the murderer. Interestingly, a few days after the body was found, one of Michelle's relatives visited the site. He noticed one of her earrings on the ground, which was strange because the police had already searched the entire area. Either they missed the shiny piece of jewelry or the killer had taken it with them initially, and later decided to return it to the scene to dispose of the evidence. Over the next few months, investigators compiled a list of 14 suspects, but they struggled to connect any of them to the crime. Without a DNA sample from the killer or other significant evidence, finding the culprit seemed like an almost impossible task. All the suspects voluntarily provided their DNA samples except for one. A 23-year-old man named Mark refused to give a sample, which made the investigators take a closer look at him. Shortly after Michelle's death, it came to light that Mark had been stalking a local woman for 8 months, even breaking into her home. Later, he was accused of harassing another woman in a nearby town. He followed her down the street, then caught up to her and started touching her. Although there wasn't enough evidence to charge him in that case, it gave the investigators in Michelle's case even more reason to be suspicious. They also discovered that Mark had been in the same class as Michelle's older brother, which meant he could have known her family well. Mark claimed that he was indeed in the town center that evening, but got home around 1:15 a.m., meaning he wouldn't have had enough time to kidnap Michelle, drive her to that field and kill her. However, when investigators spoke with his wife, they found out something interesting. She said she wasn't sure about the time and suggested that he might have come home much later. This prompted the police to install a wiretap in Mark's house, which led to another alarming discovery. It turned out that his wife also had doubts about his honesty, and had repeatedly questioned him about whether he was involved in the murder. Eventually, she convinced Mark to provide a DNA sample, but just a day before his meeting with the police, he crashed his car into a tree. Investigators suspected it might have been intentional, but a few days later, Mark did hand over his DNA sample after all. Despite his suspicious behavior, the investigators still lacked the killer's DNA, and without it or any other solid evidence, they couldn't arrest Mark. Since then, the case saw almost no progress. The police continued to investigate various suspects, but nothing led to any breakthroughs. About a year after the murder, Michelle's family decided to move to another city. They were convinced that the killer was someone local, and it became too difficult for them to stay among people they suspected. In 2000, a substantial reward of $100,000 was offered for any information leading to the capture of the culprit. This brought in several new leads, but all of them ended up going nowhere. In 2002, investigators traveled to the UK to analyze the victim's belongings and other evidence for any foreign DNA, but this too yielded no results. The case was reopened several times over the years. In 2009, the reward was increased to $500,000, setting a record for the state. This huge amount of money generated a flood of new tips and calls, but none of them brought investigators any closer to catching the killer. In 2019, 20 years after the murder, the case was reopened once again. The police still didn't have the killer's DNA, as even with modern tools, they couldn't find any foreign DNA on the victim's belongings. Given this, detectives turned their attention back to the list of suspects, which at that point had 5 names. After thoroughly re-examining each of these men, they narrowed the list down to just 2 suspects and focused their efforts on them. One of them was a 56-year-old man named Craig. He became a suspect for several reasons. At the time of Michelle's murder, he lived just 2 houses away from her. What's more, Craig moved to Sydney just 2 weeks after the crime. Craig also had a significant criminal record. He had been arrested multiple times for harassment, indecent exposure, and other similar offenses. On top of that, he was involved in various illegal activities like thefts. Moreover, Craig had been a suspect in another assault case involving a woman from Galgong just a year before Michelle's death. In that incident, the woman had returned home after a party and was sitting on her porch, waiting for her boyfriend to arrive. At some point, a man, later identified as Craig, approached her, struck her, and attempted to assault her. Fortunately, her boyfriend arrived just in time, scaring off the attacker. Although the woman initially reported the assault to the police, she ultimately decided not to press charges. The problem was that the chances of securing a conviction against Craig were low, as her testimony alone wouldn't have been enough. As a result, no charges were filed and Craig remained free. For the investigators working on Michelle's case, Craig was their prime suspect, but they needed a confession from him. So the detectives decided to take a bold and risky step. They planned a large-scale undercover operation. Given Craig's criminal history, the investigators decided to set up a sting operation. They created a fake criminal group and approached Craig, presenting themselves as an organization with serious connections, including ties to the police. They also claimed that they were looking to make a lot of money and needed one more member. Craig was intrigued by the offer and joined the gang. Over the next few months, the undercover operatives focused on gaining his trust. They kept telling him that their group was like family, and if he couldn't be fully trusted, he wouldn't be involved in the major operations. During this period, the group committed a series of crimes, but the police didn't reveal any specific details. It's possible that these crimes were staged or involved minor thefts, with the detectives willing to go to such lengths to solve the murder case. This continued for almost a year, and the investigators decided it was time to move to the next phase. The gang members told Craig that the police were interested in him because of some old murder, which threatened their entire operation. They didn't provide any details but implied that investigators were getting closer. During one of these conversations, Craig said, "I hope they won't question me about the murder of Michelle Bright." He then added that she was like a sister to him and that he had known her since she was a baby. Sometime later, another undercover officer, posing as a corrupt detective working for the gang, met with Craig. He told him that investigators from a small town were actively digging into him regarding the old murder, that they were closing in. Eventually, the detectives moved to the third step. They held a press conference announcing a record-breaking reward of $1 million for information about Michelle's murder. This was done to ensure the case made headlines across Australia and to increase Craig's anxiety. Interestingly, on the same day, Craig left a comment on the police department's social media post saying, "I feel sorry for the family." The next day was set up to meet with the gang leader, whom he had never seen in person. The role of the gang leader was played by one of the investigators. The fake boss told Craig that the police were interested in him for two separate cases, putting the entire gang at risk. He asked Craig to be completely honest and confess if he was involved. In return, he promised to help Craig resolve the situation. But despite this, Craig continued to deny any involvement in the murder. During the conversation, the fake boss showed him a folder with police materials on Michelle's case, including a photo of Craig's old car. In 1999, shortly after Craig's move to Sydney, the police had contacted him by phone regarding the investigation, and the next day his car was found burned. The boss claimed they had some evidence and that Craig could be arrested very soon. The police materials seemed to have had their effect, and Craig finally began to confess. He recounted that on the night of the murder, he had arrived in Galgong, visited a friend, and then headed to the town center, where he stopped by a bar and talked to its owner. He said he thought he left his car there and walked away, but he couldn't remember much beyond that because he had drunk a lot of alcohol. However, Craig admitted that he did indeed kill Michelle. He recalled taking her life. Realizing that such a vague confession wouldn't be enough, the fake boss proposed that Craig go to the crime scene with other gang members to refresh his memory. After that, his accomplices would take him to the airport and help him leave the country. Craig agreed, and once at the crime scene, he told how he dragged Michelle away from the road into some grass to hide her body. He added that he couldn't remember if he had assaulted her, but he detailed how he removed part of her clothing. He noted that the clasp on her bra was broken, an undisclosed detail that only the killer would have known. After that, Craig also confessed to attempting to assault another woman a year before Michelle's murder, but was interrupted by the victim's boyfriend. He described the incident in detail, providing information that confirmed the truthfulness of his account. After receiving the confession, the gang members did take Craig to the airport, but reinforcements were already waiting for him there. 20 years after the murder, Craig was arrested for Michelle's killing and was placed in jail awaiting trial. The trial began in 2023, with Craig facing charges for both Michelle's murder and the attempted assault on the other woman. He pleaded not guilty, and his lawyer argued that the confession had been obtained under pressure. The defense highlighted that Craig initially claimed his innocence to the undercover officers and only made a false confession out of fear for his safety. The prosecution, however, argued that Craig had always had a choice. He could have left the gang and remained silent about his involvement in the murder. Additionally, Craig had provided specific details such as the manner of the killing and the broken clasp on Michelle's bra, which an innocent person would not have known. The prosecution's theory was that Craig had spotted Michelle on one of the central streets and either offered her a ride or walked her home. Given that she lived just yards away from Craig and knew him well, she might have agreed. Once they reached the outskirts of town, Craig could have attacked her and dragged her away from the road towards the railroad tracks, where her body was eventually discovered. The trial lasted for 7 weeks, and Craig was ultimately found guilty of Michelle's murder and the assault on the other woman. The victim testified in court and once again identified him, but this time she didn't have to worry about him evading justice. The judge sentenced Craig to 32 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 24 years. This means he could be released when he is 77 or older. Michelle's relatives, who had long lost hope for justice, thanked the detectives for their tireless efforts in uncovering the truth. The tragedy had forever changed their family. 6 years after Michelle's death, her parents divorced and her mother struggled to live without her daughter. Her father and brothers could not stop blaming themselves, believing it was their duty to protect her. Now, they can find some solace in knowing that the murderer will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. A girl from a small town went out for a walk and disappeared without a trace. Her parents immediately panicked and called the police, but what happened next sparked outrage in their tight-knit community. This mystery remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades, and only recently did detectives uncover the truth in quite an unexpected way. Danielle Houchins was born on November 11, 1980 in Alexandria, Minnesota. Shortly after, her parents had 2 more kids, a boy and a girl. Once their youngest was born, the family decided to move to a small town called Belgrade, Montana. The quiet place was surrounded by mountains and located far from big cities, but it was a popular destination for tourists. A lot of people came there to ski or hike in the mountains, enjoying the picturesque nature. Danielle's parents chose the town mostly because they were offered jobs on the ski patrol. This was perfect for both of them since they loved spending as much time outdoors as possible. Their passion spread to their kids from a very young age, and the family was always up for an adventure. They went skiing, hiking, fishing, and took boat trips on the nearby rivers. Danielle herself got really into climbing, which was easy to get into around there. At the same time, Danielle managed to excel at school. She quickly became one of the top students and had big plans for her future. She dreamed of going to medical school and becoming a bioengineer. On September 21, 1996, their town was hosting its annual festival. People would gather on the streets, listen to music, watch some performances, and just enjoy the day together. Danielle, who was 15 at the time, had plans to meet up with her friends in the evening. But before that, she had a few free hours to kill. Instead of just sitting at home, she decided to go for a walk along the trail located near the river just outside of town. Her mom asked her to be back by 2 p.m. and gave Danielle her wristwatch since she didn't have one of her own. Danielle grabbed a bottle of water and headed out around 11:30, promising to be back on time. But 2 o'clock came and went and she still hadn't returned. Her mom started to worry, especially since they were expecting guests soon. Thinking Danielle must have just lost track of time, she decided to head to the trail to bring her home. She took a friend with her and they drove to the parking lot where the trail started. The first thing they noticed was Danielle's white pickup truck. Even though she was only 15 and technically not allowed to drive without an adult, her parents would sometimes let her use the car. It was a small, quiet town with little traffic and Danielle was already a pretty good driver. Her mom noticed the truck's doors were unlocked, but Danielle was nowhere to be seen. She and her friends started walking along the trail toward the river, but they didn't get far before they spotted Danielle's car keys and her bottle lying on the ground. Her mom became even more worried and started calling out for her, searching the path from the parking lot to the river. When there was still no sign of Danielle, she wasted no time and went straight to the authorities for help. At that point, her mom thought Danielle might have fallen off a slope or gotten injured in some accident. Since the woman didn't have a cell phone, she drove to the police station, and about an hour later, search teams arrived at the trail. The searchers combed through the trail and the surrounding woods, checking the riverbank as well, but they couldn't find any trace of Danielle. As night fell and temperatures dropped close to freezing, the rescuers decided to call off the search until morning. However, Danielle's family refused to go home. They continued searching for her, joined by family friends and local residents who broke into groups and spread out to cover more ground. In one of those search groups was a man and his 2 sons, who were friends with Danielle's sister. They headed into the wooded area near the riverbank, using flashlights to guide their way. A few hundred yards from the parking lot, they noticed something strange in the water and went closer to check it out. Shining their lights into the river, they realized it was Danielle's body, lying near the shore in just a few feet of water. The man immediately knew she was dead and ran back to his car to notify the police. On his way to the station, however, he spotted Danielle's father and broke the devastating news to him. The police examined the scene and handed Danielle's body over to medical experts, who needed a few days to conduct a proper examination and determine the cause of death. But despite this, the sheriff quickly announced that it appeared to be an accident. There were no visible wounds or signs of foul play, so the police initially believed Danielle may have just accidentally fallen into the river and drowned. Danielle's family, devastated by the news of her death, couldn't believe it. From a young age, she had spent a lot of time outdoors, was very familiar with nature, and knew that trail along the river well. Her parents also couldn't understand how she could have drowned in such shallow water. Still, the sheriff stuck to his version and didn't launch a proper investigation. But everything changed when the medical examiners released their report. They discovered that Danielle had numerous scratches and bruises, which looked like defensive wounds. It appeared she had fought back against someone. They also noted that her underwear had been pulled down. The experts found it hard to imagine how this could have happened in the course of an accident. Moreover, they established that Danielle had been sexually assaulted and found a biological sample from an unknown male on her underwear. As for the cause of death, the examiners agreed that she had been drowned, but it seemed that someone had held her underwater. They also noticed that Danielle's watch, which should have been on her wrist, was found up near her elbow. The experts suggested that the killer might have dragged her by the arms, causing the watch to slip down as he pulled her toward the river. Despite all these findings, the medical examiners for some reason still listed the manner of death as undetermined. While they were sure Danielle had drowned, they couldn't find enough solid evidence to conclusively prove it was an intentional murder. Because of this, the police didn't launch a full investigation, maintaining that they were still uncertain about what really happened to Danielle. Even so, they did try to gather more details. When forensic experts examined Danielle's clothes, they found 4 hairs on her underwear, which also belonged to an unknown male. They believe these were arm hairs and managed to extract a partial DNA sample. However, the FBI didn't yet have a national DNA database. The only thing the experts could confirm was that the hairs and the semen found on Danielle's underwear came from the same person. The police also re-examined the area where Danielle's body was found and discovered a man's boot print in the dirt, although they weren't able to determine if it was connected to the case. Investigators questioned several potential suspects they thought might be involved, but couldn't link any of them to the crime. The problem was that the DNA sample they had was only partial, so they couldn't even compare it to the suspect's DNA. It's worth mentioning that many details of this case were kept secret, not only from the public but also from Danielle's own family. For a long time, they didn't even know that she had been sexually assaulted. From their perspective, it seemed like the police genuinely didn't have any idea what happened to Danielle. We're still trying to figure it out. Despite the sheriff's position, some police officers were puzzled that the case hadn't been reclassified as homicide and investigated accordingly. One of them was Cindy Botek, who had joined the police just a few days before Danielle's death. She's been involved in the investigation and, from the very beginning, was convinced they were dealing with a murder. However, back then she didn't have the authority to go against her superiors and launch a full-scale investigation. So all she could do was wonder what had really happened that day. One of the theories was that the killer might have known Danielle, like a neighbor or a friend. Votek spoke with her parents, but they couldn't think of anyone who would want to harm their daughter. She had never had any problems with her classmates or anyone else in town. For months after Danielle's death, there was almost no progress in the case. The police continued to interview people and consider various suspects. But because of the sheriff's reluctance to start a proper investigation, they couldn't do much. Some officers, including Botek, were baffled that the case hadn't been reclassified as a homicide and that no one was actively searching for the killer. To them, it was obvious that Danielle had been attacked and the person responsible could still be living in their community. A few years after the murder, the police tried entering the partial DNA sample found on Danielle's body into the FBI database, but no matches were found. In the years following Danielle's death, her family learned more details about the case, including the fact that she had been sexually assaulted. They were outraged that the sheriff hadn't treated it as a homicide from the start and had kept such critical information from them. The sheriff later claimed he had never considered the case an accident and had always believed it was a murder. This contradicted his earlier statements to local newspapers, where he had clearly said there wasn't enough evidence to label it a homicide. Danielle's parents also remembered him telling them the same thing, which only fueled their frustration and confusion. The sheriff then tried to shift the focus onto the medical examiners, insisting that the only reason he didn't launch a full investigation was because they had listed the manner of death as undetermined. But Danielle's family believed the sheriff was just trying to avoid responsibility. Everyone understood that a proper investigation in the first few days after the murder could have helped solve the case and catch the killer, but little effort was made. Now, many years later, finding the murderer had become far more difficult with the trail gone cold. Danielle's parents continued to fight for a fair investigation, but each attempt led to a dead end. Eventually, her younger sister took up the case, giving interviews to local media, reaching out to investigators, and doing everything in her power to ensure that one day Danielle's killer would be found. In 2019, 23 years after the murder, Danielle's family finally managed to get the investigation reopened. Unfortunately, this didn't lead to any real breakthroughs. The FBI's DNA database still didn't show any matches, and re-examining old suspects went nowhere, leaving the case stalled once again. This continued until 2021, when a new sheriff took over the local police department. He had joined the force just days before Danielle's death, and her case had haunted him ever since. Like some of his colleagues, he had always believed it was a murder, and now he had the authority to launch a full investigation. But after so many years, he had almost no solid leads, except for the partial DNA sample from the possible perpetrator. The sheriff realized the case needed a fresh perspective, so he brought in two outside experts. One was a former investigator from California who now worked as a private detective, and the other was a DNA specialist. Together, they focused on identifying the owner of the hair and the biological material found on Danielle's underwear. First, they sent the samples to a lab in California, which had some of the most advanced DNA analysis tools, and then they waited. Around the same time, in August 2023, Danielle's case was officially reclassified as a homicide, nearly 27 years after her death. A few months later, in early 2024, experts from the lab contacted the investigators, saying they hadn't gotten closer to identifying the owner of the DNA. Although they had managed to do something important, their tools allowed them to extract a full DNA profile, which was still a significant step forward. The investigators then sent these samples to another lab in Virginia, hoping they could use genetic genealogy to trace the DNA back to its owner. Several months passed before they finally got the call they were waiting for. The experts at the Virginia lab explained that they had uploaded the perpetrator's DNA profile to public genetic databases, where people voluntarily share their DNA to find relatives. These databases have helped solve many cases using genetic genealogy, tracing suspects through their family trees. But this time, things took an unexpected turn. To the experts, they immediately got a perfect match. It turned out that the owner of the DNA had willingly submitted his sample to the database, something that doesn't happen often. The man was 55-year-old Paul Hutchinson, who lived in a small town called Dillon about 100 miles from where Danielle was killed. Investigators discovered that at the time of the murder, Hutchinson was 27 and a student at the University of Montana, just 12 miles from Belgrade. He had a degree in biology and worked for Montana's Bureau of Land Management. Paul was also married with 2 children. What stood out even more was that he had no criminal record, not even the slightest offense. Now that the police had identified their suspect, they needed to obtain a direct DNA sample from him. On July 23rd, they went to his workplace to talk to him. As they pulled up to the bureau building, they saw Paul standing outside with his coworkers. The investigators told him they wanted to ask him a few questions at the station, and according to them, they could see the color drain from his face. Still, Paul agreed to go in for questioning. The detectives took their time, starting by asking about other unsolved cases in the area. Paul remained fairly calm at first, but everything changed when they showed him a photo of Danielle. He suddenly became extremely nervous, sweating, scratching his face, and even chewing on his hands. He could barely stand up and even stumbled over a chair when trying to get up. To the police, his reaction was almost a confirmation of guilt. However, Paul continued to deny any involvement in the murder, but his confession wasn't necessary. Detectives collected his DNA sample and sent it to the lab. For now, they let him go, since they didn't have enough evidence to charge him with the murder until the lab results came back. Right after the interrogation, the detectives contacted Danielle's sister and told her that they had finally found her sister's killer. They added that the police had no doubt about his guilt and that the DNA analysis would only confirm it. Danielle's sister, who had been waiting nearly 28 years for this moment, felt relieved knowing the person responsible would finally face justice. She was also aware that they still had to go through a long court process to bring this case to a close. But things took an unexpected turn. The day after the interrogation, when the police were supposed to receive the DNA results from the lab, called his local police station, saying he needed help. He gave the operator his location and then hung up. When officers arrived at the scene, they found Paul's car parked on the side of the road. Inside, they found him dead with a gun lying beside him. During the investigation, detectives concluded that Paul did it himself. There was no note in the car, but his motive seemed clear. He likely realized there was no way to avoid prison, where he would spend the rest of his life. For his wife and children, the entire situation was a complete shock. None of them knew what Paul had done nearly 30 years ago, and they weren't even aware that he had been questioned by the police. His family learned about these accusations at the same time they found out about his death. Paul's friends and co-workers were just as stunned when the truth came out. They all saw him as a devoted family man and a reliable friend. Despite the shock to those who knew him, detectives had no doubt that Paul was responsible for Danielle's murder. In August 2024, they held a press conference where they announced that his DNA was a perfect match with the samples found on the victim's underwear. Police believe this was a crime of opportunity. There was no evidence that Danielle knew Paul. It's likely she crossed paths with him near the trail, and he made the decision to assault her, killing her afterward to ensure she wouldn't identify him. Danielle's family admitted that hearing about Paul's death brought them more relief than frustration, even though he would not face a lifetime in prison. What angered them most was the thought that he could have been caught decades earlier if the local sheriff had taken the case more seriously. If that had happened, Paul wouldn't have been able to live nearly 30 years of freedom, start a family, and enjoy a peaceful life. Paul's wife also expressed her condolences to Danielle's family, stating that she in no way supported or excused what he had done. A woman was found in her own home under strange and unsettling circumstances. There were no clues, no evidence, nothing for detectives to go on. It looked like the case would remain a mystery, but then an unexpected phone call turned the entire investigation on its head. And with just one unusual clue, detectives uncovered a truth no one could have predicted. Kathy Blair was born on May 31, 1961, in California. She grew up in a loving family with her parents, a brother, and a sister. From an early age, she had a deep passion for the arts, but music was what she loved the most. Singing was more than just a hobby, it was her true passion. So, when it was time to choose a career, Kathy didn't have to think twice. She knew exactly what she wanted. She enrolled at the University of Texas to study vocal performance and moved to Austin. After graduating, became a music teacher and a Christian choir instructor. She absolutely loved her job, and her students adored her. They could see how much heart she put into music, and her passion was contagious. Over the years, Kathy was married twice, but both marriages ended in divorce. She had 2 children, a son and a daughter, whom she raised on her own. In 2013, when she was 52, Kathy moved into a new home in a quiet, safe suburb of Austin. She had been dreaming of a place that checked all her boxes, and she had finally found the perfect one. By then, her children were grown and living on their own, while Kathy continued her work in music and led the choir. In December 2014, her son Joe came to stay with her for a few weeks. He was 23 and serving in the military. Before his next deployment, he wanted to spend some time at home with his mom. On December 5th, Joe went out to meet some friends and didn't return home until almost noon the next day. As he walked into the house, he called out for his mom, but there was only silence. Feeling uneasy, he started checking the rooms one by one until he reached Kathy's bedroom. What he saw there was horrifying. She was lying on the floor next to her bed, surrounded by a pool of blood. Joe knew immediately she was gone. Panicked, he ran outside and called the police. When investigators got there, They quickly confirmed that Kathy had been dead for several hours, and from the sheer amount of blood at the scene, it was clear this wasn't an accident. This was murder. While the medical experts examined the body, police officers began processing the crime scene. One of the first things they noticed was that the drawers from a large jewelry box in her bedroom had been pulled out and were scattered on the floor. It looked like the killer had taken some of Kathy's jewelry, leading detectives to consider robbery as the primary motive. But something about that theory felt off. For one, the intruder hadn't taken anything else. Valuable items like Kathy's laptop, phone, and other expensive things were left untouched, right out in the open. The house wasn't ransacked, and there was no sign that the killer had searched for anything beyond the jewelry. Then there was the timing. Break-ins at night were pretty uncommon. Most burglars preferred to strike during the day when homeowners were at work. On top of that, this particular neighborhood was considered one of the safest in the city. Crimes like this just didn't happen there. Another strange detail was the sequence of events. It seemed like the killer had murdered Kathy first and only then started searching for valuables. Blood stains on the jewelry box drawers and other parts of the bedroom suggested that the attack happened before the so-called robbery began. That meant the intruder must have attacked Kathy the moment they stepped into her bedroom. Adding to the mystery, there were no signs of forced entry at the front door, although investigators found that the back door had been left unlocked. When they asked Joe about it, he explained that his mother often left that door open. With all this in mind, detectives started to wonder, was this really a robbery or just a cover-up? What if the killer had planned to murder Kathy all along? And if that was the case, it raised an even more chilling question. Could the person responsible have known her? And if so, they also know about that unlocked back door? Despite their best efforts, forensic experts couldn't find any evidence that might lead them to the killer. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing that could identify the person responsible. The only clue they managed to recover was a partial shoe print in Kathy's bedroom, left behind in her blood. The medical examiners determined that Kathy had died from multiple stab wounds and also showed signs of strangulation. However, there was no evidence of SA, which only reinforced detectives' suspicion that this wasn't a random crime. It seemed personal. With no physical evidence to go on, police shifted their focus to Kathy's inner circle, looking for anyone who might have had a reason to harm her. Naturally, they started with her son, since he theoretically had the opportunity to commit the crime. But after checking his alibi, detectives quickly ruled him out. He had spent the entire night with friends, and his whereabouts were confirmed. Next, they spoke with Kathy's friends and coworkers, hoping to uncover any conflicts or grudges. But according to everyone they interviewed, had no enemies. She was well-liked, never got into fights, and devoted most of her time to the choir. Just when it seemed like they had hit a dead end, detectives came across a lead. Several of Kathy's close friends mentioned that she had frequently talked about her second ex-husband, the man she had divorced 4 years before the murder. According to Kathy, their breakup had been anything but smooth. Her ex-husband wouldn't leave her alone, kept showing up, refusing to let go. At one point, she even told friends she was worried for her safety and asked them not to tell him where she had moved. Detectives tracked the man down and discovered he was living not far from Austin. When they went to speak with him, his reaction immediately raised red flags. The moment they mentioned Kathy's death, his first response was she shot? That struck them as odd. Why would he assume she had been shot, rather than stabbed or killed some other way? When asked about his whereabouts that night, he claimed he had been staying in his RV for a short getaway. He even let detectives search it without a warrant. But despite their suspicions, they found nothing. No weapons, no blood, no signs that he had anything to do with the crime. Without any concrete evidence, they couldn't pin anything on him. He remained on their radar, but with no real leads, detectives had no choice but to keep looking for other suspects. A few days later, detectives received an unexpected call from one of Kathy's friends, who had something strange to share. She and a few others had organized a memorial service in Kathy's honor, and during the ceremony, a man they didn't recognize stood up to give a speech. From the very first words out of his mouth, something fell off. His tone, his mannerisms, Everything about him made the guests uneasy. But the strangest part was that no one there knew who he was. These were Kathy's closest friends, yet not a single one of them had ever seen this man before. And as he spoke, it became clear that he hadn't actually known Kathy either. His words didn't match reality, almost as if he was making things up on the spot. Curious, detectives asked around, and one of Kathy's friends finally recognized him. He had seen the man before. He worked as a sales clerk at a local women's clothing store. Police tracked this person down and questioned him. The man admitted he had never met Kathy. He said he had read about her murder in the news, felt sad, and decided to attend the memorial. His explanation was pretty weird, but there was no real evidence linking him to the crime. So, with nothing to hold him on, detectives had to move on, still searching for their killer. For several days, the case remained at a standstill until an unexpected twist changed everything. A man named Rob called the police, saying he had something they might want to see. According to his story, he had recently bought a new scope for his hunting rifle. This wasn't just any scope, it was equipped with a thermal imaging camera. Excited to test it out, he decided to take a walk in the early hours of December 6th, heading toward a wooded area near the edge of his neighborhood. As he walked, a car slowly drove past him before pulling over to the side of the road. A few seconds later, a man stepped out and headed down one of the nearby streets, disappearing into the night. At the time, Rob didn't think much of it, but later, when he saw the news about Kathy's murder, something clicked. The man he saw had been walking in the direction of her house. That's when he remembered his thermal camera had been recording the entire time. He went back and reviewed the footage, and there it was, the man clearly visible walking away from his car. Detectives were intrigued by the footage, but there was one major problem. It was recorded using thermal imaging, which meant it only captured the suspect's silhouette, so identifying him based on that alone would be nearly impossible. Still, the video provided some valuable clues. The man appeared to be tall, broad-shouldered, and had a distinct way of walking. And more importantly, the camera had also captured his car. Investigators hoped they could at least narrow down a list of possible vehicle models from the footage. They compared the man's height and build to their two main suspects, Kathy's ex-husband, and the strange man from the memorial, but neither of them matched the silhouette in the recording. Their cars didn't match either. This only deepened detectives' doubts about both men's involvement, effectively bringing them back to square one. Over the next few days, they kept analyzing the footage, trying to extract any useful details, while also searching for new potential suspects. But despite their efforts, nothing substantial came from it. The case, once again, was at a frustrating standstill. Then, on December 15th, everything changed. That morning, police received a call from a caretaker who had gone to check on an elderly couple, Billy and Sydney Shelton. As she approached their house, she immediately noticed something was wrong. The front door was wide open and there were clear signs of a forced entry near the lock. Stepping inside, she made her way to the bedroom and what she saw was horrifying. The couple was lying in a pool of blood, their bodies motionless. Without hesitation, she called the police. Medical examiners later confirmed that both victims had suffered multiple stab wounds, just like Kathy. Meanwhile, detectives noticed a chilling detail. The drawers of their jewelry box had been pulled out and scattered around the room, with all the jewelry missing. But just like in Kathy's case, nothing else of value had been taken. Detectives couldn't ignore the striking similarities between this crime and Kathy's murder. From the very beginning, considered the possibility that the same person was responsible. The victims lived just 15 minutes apart. Both attacks happened at night while the victims were sleeping, and in both cases the killer emptied their jewelry boxes but took nothing else of value. From the beginning, investigators had believed Kathy's murder might have been personal, committed by someone she knew. But now they had to reconsider everything. What if this wasn't about revenge or a personal grudge? What if the killer was choosing victims at random, based on some unknown pattern? Detectives looked for any connection between Kathy and the Sheltons, mutual friends, places they might have visited, anything that could link them. But there was nothing. Their lives had never crossed. That led to one chilling realization: they might be dealing with a serial killer. Now, this wasn't just about solving a murder, It was a race against time before he struck again. Police began re-interviewing everyone connected to the victims, hoping that someone would remember even the smallest detail that could lead them to the killer. They urged people to share anything, no matter how insignificant it might seem. And eventually that approach paid off. One of Kathy's friends recalled a conversation they had a few months before her murder. Kathy had mentioned a disturbing encounter with a handyman who had been hired by her landlord to do some repairs on the house. She told her that the job had been done poorly, but more than that, something about the man's behavior had unsettled her. Detectives contacted the landlord, who was able to track down the worker's contact information. It was a local resident named Timothy Parlins. The first thing detectives discovered was that Timothy's brother worked at the church regularly attended by the Sheltons, and Timothy himself had also been seen there. Then they dug into his background and found something even more concerning. Timothy had a long rap sheet. He had been arrested multiple times for theft, and his targets were almost always jewelry. At time of the investigation, Timothy was out on parole and living in a long-stay hotel. Detectives went to see him and he agreed to answer their questions, but when they asked to come up to his room, he refused. Instead, he insisted on speaking with them outside, in the hotel parking lot. At first, Timothy claimed he didn't remember Kathy, but when detectives provided more details, he suddenly recalled doing some repairs at her house. He insisted he had nothing to do with her murder and even said he had an alibi. Had been working the night shift at a convenience store when Kathy was killed. As they spoke, detectives couldn't help but notice that Timothy didn't seem to match the silhouette from the thermal camera footage. He was significantly shorter than the man in the video, and his car didn't resemble the one seen that night. So, with no solid evidence against him, they left empty-handed. But then something unexpected happened. When they called Timothy's employer to verify his alibi, they learned that he had been fired a week before Kathy's murder. There was no way he could have been working that night. Detectives immediately rushed back to the hotel, but Timothy was already gone. Instead, his wife answered the door and allowed them to search their room. That's when they finally caught a break. Inside, they found a pawn shop receipt showing that Timothy had sold several pieces of jewelry, and the date on the receipt was the same day Kathy was murdered. Detectives went straight to the pawn shop and quickly confirmed that the jewelry Timothy had sold belonged to Kathy. But that wasn't all. The shop's security cameras had captured footage of the parking lot, and what they saw there was even more interesting. Timothy hadn't arrived in his own car, which meant he had access to another vehicle. After running the plates, police discovered that the vehicle belonged to his sister, and that was a crucial detail because the car looked almost identical to the one caught on the thermal camera on the night of Kathy's murder. That was enough for detectives to secure a warrant to search the vehicle. As soon as forensic experts started examining the car, they found traces of blood on the front seat and the floor. When the lab results came back, they confirmed the worst. Was Kathy's blood. Right after that, police arrested Timothy and brought him in for questioning. But even when confronted with all the evidence, he refused to admit anything. Instead, he kept repeating the same phrase over and over. These hands have never killed anyone. Detectives interrogated Timothy for hours, him on the evidence against him, and eventually he cracked, but not in the way they expected. He continued to insist that he hadn't killed anyone, but now claimed to know who did. According to him, the real murderer was a man named Sean. Naturally, investigators were skeptical. The case against Timothy was quite strong, and the sudden shift in blame felt like a desperate attempt to escape justice. Still, they decided to check out Sean just in case. Nothing about what they found screamed murderer. Sean Gantbinocasser, 30, was a former science teacher with a degree in microbiology, and he had no criminal record. On top of that, he lived several hundred miles from Austin, making his involvement seem even less likely. Still, detectives needed to be 100% sure, so they traveled to his town to question him. Sean admitted that he had met Timothy a few months prior and found him to be a shady character. They hadn't spoken much since. A few minutes later, he said something quite weird. He had actually been in Austin on the nights of both murders. Even more interesting, he revealed that he had stayed at Timothy's place during that time. The situation only grew more confusing from there. At first, Sean claimed that on the night of Kathy's murder, Timothy had left the house without saying a word, but just minutes later, he suddenly changed his story. Now, he admitted that they had actually gone to Kathy's house together. According to him, Timothy got out of the car and returned a few minutes later, carrying a blood-stained bag. Later, when Sean peeked inside, he saw some jewelry. That's when he realized Timothy had done something terrible. But he insisted he had no idea what was going to happen and had never planned to be part of any crime. As detectives continued questioning him, Sean asked to use the restroom and they let him step out. One of the investigators watched as he walked away, and that's when something clicked. His stride, his posture, his movement. It all looked eerily similar to the silhouette captured on the thermal camera the night Kathy was murdered. That raised a serious question. Detectives were no longer sure he was telling the truth. Now, they strongly suspected that Sean was the real killer. But without a confession, they had nothing solid to build a case against him. With Timothy, at least they had some physical evidence tying him to the crime. But with Sean, they had absolutely nothing. When he returned from the restroom, they kept pressing him, challenging his version of events. They told him they didn't believe he had stayed in the car and suggested that maybe Timothy had forced him into Kathy's house, threatening him in some way. It was a calculated move and it worked. Sean hesitated, then finally admitted that he had entered the house alone. According to him, he had gone inside only to steal valuables while Timothy waited outside. He said he slipped in through the unlocked back door, started looking through the rooms for anything worth taking. When he reached Kathy's bedroom, he saw the jewelry box, and Kathy still asleep in bed. Sean initially stuck to his story. He claimed he had carefully taken the valuables and left without harming Kathy. He even suggested that Timothy might have returned to the house after the robbery and committed the murder for reasons unknown to him, but detectives weren't buying it. They knew that blood had been found on the jewelry box, meaning the killer had only taken the valuables after the murder, which contradicted Sean's version completely. They kept pressing him, breaking down his lies piece by piece, and finally he cracked. Sean admitted that he had killed Kathy. According to him, as soon as he entered her bedroom, she woke up and lunged at him. Panicking, he pulled out a knife and stabbed her multiple times. Once she was dead, he grabbed the jewelry, rushed out of the house, and got back into the car. Detectives still had doubts about Sean's story. They found it hard to believe that Kathy had suddenly jumped at him and tried to grab his knife. But regardless of the details, his confession was enough to arrest him. To strengthen their case, they took his shoes and had forensic experts compare the soles to the bloody footprint found in Kathy's bedroom. It was a perfect match. However, there was still one major problem: the murder of the elderly couple. When detectives questioned Sean about it, his entire demeanor changed. He immediately asked for a lawyer and refused to say another word. With no evidence directly linking him to that crime, investigators were at a dead end. So they turned back to Timothy. He was arrested as an accomplice in Kathy's murder, and under Texas law, that meant he faced the same charges as Sean, even if he hadn't physically participated in the killing. Whether he liked it or not, he was going down with him. Timothy admitted that he had driven Sean to Kathy's house, but insisted that he had never stepped out of the car and had no idea his partner was going to kill her. However, he did confess to selling Kathy's stolen jewelry, which directly tied him to the crime. When detectives pressed him about the murder of the elderly couple, he admitted that he and Sean had gone there to rob the house as well. But just like before, he claimed that he had stayed in the car while Sean went inside. Investigators considered the possibility that Timothy was telling the truth. The thermal camera footage from Kathy's murder had clearly shown only one person exiting the vehicle. If the same pattern had been followed in the second crime, it was likely that Sean had acted alone once again. In the end, Timothy was charged in all 3 murders due to his role in the crimes, even though he hadn't committed the killings himself. As for Sean, he was officially charged with Kathy's murder, but detectives still weren't able to prove his involvement in the second case. At least not yet. The court ruled that Timothy and Sean would be tried separately. During his trial, Timothy maintained that he had no involvement in the murders and had no idea his partner was going to kill anyone. But that didn't change the fact that he had driven Sean to both crime scenes and profited from selling Kathy's stolen jewelry. In the end, the jury found him guilty and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sean's trial, however, was much more complicated. Unlike Timothy, who was directly linked to Kathy's case by physical evidence, the case against Sean rested mostly on his confession, a shoe print in Kathy's bedroom, and the thermal camera footage. His lawyer immediately went on the attack, claiming that detectives had coerced Sean into confessing and pressured him into taking the blame for someone else's crime. He also insisted that the rest of the evidence was purely circumstantial. As a result, the jury couldn't reach a unanimous verdict, forcing the judge to declare a mistrial. But prosecutors weren't giving up, and a few months later was back in court for a second trial. This time, the prosecution managed to convince the jury of Sean's guilt, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole for Kathy's murder. However, despite strong suspicions, he was never officially charged in the killing of the elderly couple. Investigators were certain he had committed those murders as well, but without solid evidence, they couldn't make the charges stick. In the end, both men faced justice. There were still unanswered questions in the case. Detectives were never able to determine why Sean had killed his victims. If Kathy had really woken up while he was in the bedroom, he could have simply run away. It was pitch dark, and she wouldn't have been able to identify him. The only thing they could reasonably conclude was why Timothy had chosen Kathy as a target for the robbery. It seemed likely that he had held a grudge against her ever since she complained to her landlord about his poor quality repairs months earlier. That complaint had affected his paycheck. He may have resented her for it. Whether that resentment played a role in what ultimately happened that night, no one could say for sure. But one thing was clear: what started as a simple burglary had ended in cold-blooded murder. As for the elderly couple, detectives had no solid theories about the motive behind their murders. They considered the possibility that Timothy had interacted with them at church and that some kind of conflict had led to his resentment, just like with Kathy. But that was purely speculation. When it came to Sean, investigators couldn't rule out the possibility that he had no motive at all, that he simply wanted to kill. If that were the case, then there was every reason to believe that he would have continued murdering if he hadn't been caught. One final crucial detail about Sean's second trial was how much weight the prosecution placed on the thermal camera footage. That single piece of evidence ended up being the deciding factor in securing his conviction. If that neighbor hadn't decided to test out his new thermal scope in the middle of the night, if he hadn't happened to record the exact moment Sean left his car, the case against him might have fallen apart completely. Sean could have walked free. Morgan Nick was born on September 12, 1988, in the small town of Ozark, Arkansas. Shortly after her birth, her parents welcomed a son and a year later, another daughter. Morgan had a wonderful relationship with her younger siblings. They could spend hours playing together, and the little ones admired her in every way. When she was just starting to learn how to read, Morgan would practice with children's books, reading bedtime stories to her brother. She was also an animal lover from a young age, would often tell her parents that she wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. In elementary school, joined the Girl Scouts where she had fun making crafts, going on nature trips, and just enjoying time with the other girls. When Morgan was 6, her parents decided to get a divorce, but the kids still got to spend lots of time with their dad. In early summer of 1995, a family friend invited Morgan's mom to a Little League baseball game in a nearby town called Alma. At first, she thought about declining. After all, it was a Friday evening and the stadium was nearly 30 miles away. But in the end, she decided to go and take Morgan along, figuring it might be a fun way to spend time together. On the evening of June 9th, Morgan's mom left the younger kids with her grandmother and headed to the stadium. Although it was a small venue, about 300 people had shown up for the game, including parents and other kids. She found her friends and they settled in to watch the game. But it didn't take long for Morgan to get bored. After a while, she noticed 2 kids she knew, and they invited her to come play and catch fireflies near the stadium. At first, her mom was hesitant to let her go. It was already getting dark and they were visiting the town for the first time, so she was worried that something could happen to her. But her friends reassured her that their kids played near the stadium all the time and there was nothing to worry about. Reluctantly, she let Morgan go, and the girl ran off with the other kids. They stopped by a small hill, still within her mom's sight, and she kept an eye on Morgan every now and then. About 15 minutes later, the baseball game ended, and the players started heading toward the bleachers to meet their parents. Morgan's mom looked away for just a few seconds, but when she glanced back, her daughter was already gone. The two kids she'd been playing with were walking towards the bleachers, and Morgan wasn't with them. The woman approached the kids and asked if they had seen her daughter. They explained that before heading back to the stadium, they had stopped to shake the sand out of their shoes after playing. They went over to a car in the parking lot, leaned on it, and emptied their shoes, with Morgan standing behind the car while they were at the front. Once they were done, they started walking back to the stadium, but Morgan was nowhere to be seen. Her friends assumed she had just stayed near the car to wait for her mom, so they didn't think much of it and went on their way. Morgan's mom looked toward the parking lot and spotted her car, but there was no sign of Morgan. She rushed over and checked inside, but her daughter was nowhere to be found. Panic began to set in and she returned to the kids, hoping they could shed some light on Morgan's disappearance. She asked them where her daughter could have gone, but they had no idea, although they did mention that they had seen a man in the parking lot while they were playing. He was standing near a red pickup truck, watching the stadium and occasionally glancing their way. At one point, he even approached them and said something, but they couldn't recall his exact words. They only remembered that he spoke with some kind of a country accent. Thinking that this man might have had something to do with her daughter's disappearance, Morgan's mom immediately called the police. 6 minutes later, officers arrived at the stadium and first spoke to the kids who had been with Morgan before she vanished. During their conversation, the police were able to get more details about the man near the stadium. Piecing together the children's accounts, the investigators concluded that he was a white man between 23 and 30 years old, around 6 feet tall with an average build, a beard, a mustache, and dark hair. The kids also remembered his vehicle quite well. It was an old red pickup truck with Arkansas plates and a white camper shell on the back. This detail struck the officers as suspicious because a camper shell could easily fit an adult, let alone a child. Another odd thing was that the camper seemed unusually short for the truck, making it look out of place for that model. This raised further suspicion that the man might be directly involved in Morgan's disappearance and could have used the camper to abduct her. The kids also mentioned that the man was wearing only jeans and had no shirt on. The officers immediately searched the parking lot. They couldn't find any vehicle matching the description. After speaking with the kids, they began questioning everyone who was still at the stadium. However, all of the 300 attendees had been focused on the game and none of them recalled seeing anything strange or suspicious that evening. A search around the stadium also came up empty, so the officers expanded their efforts to the nearby streets. Despite their best efforts, no trace of Morgan was found that night. Her mother was devastated. She refused to go home and ended up spending the rest of the night at the fire station. The next day, the search intensified as news of Morgan's disappearance spread quickly throughout the area, prompting dozens of volunteers to come forward. Soon, the FBI and state police joined the efforts, providing helicopters for aerial searches and creating a suspect sketch based on Morgan's friends' descriptions. The sketch, along with photos of Morgan, was distributed across the town and nearby communities in the hopes that someone would recognize the man. Initially, the authorities also thought that Morgan might have simply wandered off from the parking lot and gotten lost. But as nearly 24 hours passed without any sign of her, it became clear that if that were the case, she would have been found by then. That evening, police also began receiving alarming reports from parents who shared some disturbing stories. One woman told them that just a few hours before the baseball game, a stranger had tried to lure her 4-year-old daughter into his red pickup truck. It happened near a laundromat in Alma while the woman was inside, and her daughter was standing near the building. When the mother came out, the man drove off. She provided a description of the suspect, which matched the sketch of Morgan's possible abductor. The day after Morgan's disappearance, another report came in from a witness in Fort Smith, a town not far from Alma. He saw a man trying to lure a 9-year-old girl into a public restroom, but the girl managed to get away. Once again, the man's description matched the composite sketch based on the accounts from Morgan's friends. All of this pointed to the possibility that the person behind Morgan's disappearance might have previously attempted to abduct other victims or even successfully committed similar crimes in the past. The police focused on locating the red pickup truck matching the witness description and began checking the backgrounds of known offenders in nearby towns. Over the next few weeks, investigators received hundreds of tips about potential suspects, but they either couldn't establish a connection or confirmed that the individuals had no involvement in the crime. Meanwhile, investigators continued to comb the area around the stadium, collecting various items that could potentially be considered as evidence. They found several cigarette butts, bottles, and other objects, which were sent to the lab for DNA analysis. But in the end, the police had no clear indication whether any of these items were actually connected to Morgan's disappearance. As for the red pickup truck, the police received nearly 250 calls from witnesses across various towns and even neighboring states, all reporting sightings of similar vehicles. The problem was that a lot of residents drove similar models. There were literally thousands of them. Investigators tried to check each owner, but once again, they found no evidence linking any of them to Morgan's disappearance. This continued for 2 weeks until the police received a surprising call. A resident of a town called Stuttgart, about a 3-hour drive from Ulm, was on his property when he noticed a man trying to break into his car. The homeowner scared him off and the intruder immediately fled. When he was running away, the witness saw that the man was holding a little girl by the hand. The police showed him the composite sketch of the suspect and he confirmed that the person trying to get into his car looked very similar to the suspect and the girl resembled Morgan. Investigators quickly launched a large-scale operation in Stuttgart, securing an area of about 10 square miles and deploying several dozen officers. Morgan's parents immediately headed to the town, hoping their daughter would be finally found. Hundreds of volunteers, along with the police, began searching the entire town and surrounding area. Helicopters scanned from above and search dogs tried to pick up Morgan's scent using her belongings. The search continued for 16 hours, but they found no trace of the missing girl. Eventually, the police began to doubt the witness's story. They conducted 2 polygraph tests, both of which suggested he was lying. Although the man insisted he was telling the truth, he eventually admitted that he had made up the entire story. He did see someone trying to break into his car, but he hadn't gotten a good look at the person's face and there was no little girl with him. The man was arrested for providing false information, which cost nearly a full day of search efforts and thousands of dollars. It's unclear if he faced any punishment, but such actions typically result in a serious fine or a jail sentence. Investigators found themselves back at square one. Giving up wasn't an option. They brought in 17 more officers from across the state, and the team focused on sorting through the leads that kept coming in. By then, they had over 1,500 tips, but none of them brought detectives any closer to finding Morgan. Her parents didn't give up either, but as the months went by, their hopes started to fade. About a year after Morgan disappeared, her mom found a nonprofit dedicated to finding missing children. Although she was still focused on searching for her daughter, there weren't any new clues left to follow. That's when she began helping other families who were going through similar tragedies, and she put her efforts into raising awareness about the dangers that could strike at any moment in a child's life. Over the next several years, police kept following up on various leads and questioning potential suspects, but nothing seemed to bring any progress. In 2001, 6 years after Morgan's disappearance, the FBI released an age-progressed image showing what she might look like. That same year, several well-known TV shows aired segments about her case, which led to an increase in the number of tips. Although most of these tips turned out to be dead ends, one in particular caught the investigators' attention. The caller claimed that the girl's body was buried on a property in Boonville, a small town about an hour from Ulm. The police took this tip seriously because the person provided specific details about the case that had never been made public. In early 2002, they obtained a search warrant for the property. Bringing search dogs along, they dug up the entire area, but no trace of Morgan was found. Since then, the case remained cold for nearly a decade. In 2010, police received another tip about a possible location where Morgan's abductor might have held her, this time in another state. They conducted a search. But once again, there was no evidence to suggest the girl had ever been there. Interestingly, in 2017, police returned to search the same house, but this time for a different investigation. It turned out that a man who had once lived there was in prison for crimes against minors, and authorities suspected him in another similar case. But even then, the search turned up no new clues. In 2019, a new documentary about the case was released. For the first time since Morgan's disappearance, police shared a photo of the red pickup truck believed to be connected to the abductor. The vehicle had been briefly captured on someone's camera during the game, but the poor quality and angle made it nearly impossible to make out any important details. Following the documentary's release, police reached out to the public, asking for any information about who might have owned the truck. They received a series of new tips, but despite these efforts, they still couldn't make any progress in solving the case. This continued until 2021, when investigators finally named their main suspect in the case. The man was Billy Lynx, who had come to the police's attention in the early weeks of Morgan's disappearance. Lynx had a criminal record for offenses against minors, and he owned a similar red pickup truck. However, in 1995, police could not establish any connection between him and Morgan's disappearance, even after searching his truck. During his questioning, they felt that Billy was being honest about his innocence. He was also significantly older than 30, while detectives relied on Morgan's friends' accounts that described the abductor as being younger. Now, nearly 30 years later, detectives began to look at him again. This time, they hoped that modern DNA analysis tools could uncover any traces of Morgan's presence in his vehicle. But there were some issues. Billy had passed away in 2000 while serving time for an attempted abduction. Just 2 months after Morgan's disappearance, he tried to lure another girl into his car while she was standing outside a store. Her mother scared him off and reported the incident to the police, leading to his arrest. At that time, he was 70 years old, and he died of natural causes 5 years later while still in prison. Another complication was that police had no idea where Billy's pickup truck was, or if it even still existed after nearly 3 decades. The investigators focused on tracking down the pickup truck, and after some time, they managed to trace its chain of ownership since Billy's arrest. To the surprise of the detectives, they actually found the truck. It was still running, and the current owner agreed to let the police examine it. Initially, the detectives didn't get their hopes up too high, since any DNA evidence could have easily been erased or degraded over the years. But surprisingly, forensic experts found a few hairs in the truck bed that seemed to match Morgan's hair. The samples were sent to a Texas lab, equipped with the latest DNA analysis technology, for a closer look. It took 8 months, but finally there was a breakthrough. They managed to extract a DNA sample from the hair and compared it to Morgan's mother's DNA. The results indicated a close genetic match in the first degree of relation. In other words, the hair likely belonged to one of her children or siblings. Morgan's mother stated that she had never heard of Billy Lynx and had never met him in her life. Detectives also knew that no one else from Morgan's immediate family could have been in that truck, which meant that the little girl herself must have been there. On October 1, 2024, the police held a press conference to announce that Billy Lynx was now officially considered responsible for Morgan's abduction, and they had no doubt about his involvement. Unfortunately, no one believes that Morgan could still be alive nearly 29 years after her disappearance. Investigators suspect that Billy killed her in the first few days after the abduction, but where he hid her remains is still unknown. Even though the case is considered essentially solved, the police have declared that they will continue searching for her remains. Still, without a confession from Billy, this task seems nearly impossible. Detectives are also going to look into Billy's possible involvement in other cases. Considering that he had attempted at least a few kidnappings shortly after Morgan's disappearance, the police suspect that there could be many more crimes in his past. At the time of Morgan's abduction was already 70 years old, and it seems likely that he had a long history of such offenses. Plus, he had served in the military during World War II, giving him certain skills that may have been used in his crimes. It's worth noting that Morgan's disappearance became one of the most well-known crimes in all of Arkansas. Authorities even decided to rename the Amber Alert system to Morgan Alert in her memory. As for her mother, she continues to help other children and families through her nonprofit organization. This work has been her way of coping with the loss of her daughter. Though deep down, she still holds on to a small hope that Morgan might somehow be alive. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.